Chapter 1. Saved by Mr. Bates. The bell rang, and Oliver stared at the student in the seat in front of him. Rory Henderson was more loyal than a puppy, but sometimes the guy was just a pain in the rear. "Rory," Oliver whispered. The other students were getting up and leaving the room as Mrs. King hollered the homework at the last second as usual.
"Read chapter 12 and be ready for a quiz on Napoleon Bonaparte first thing on Friday."
Also as usual, no one was listening since the bell had rung. They all knew that Principal Burke had told that old bat Mrs. King she wasn't allowed to do that anymore because it never worked and only frustrated both teacher and student. All that mattered to Oliver was that he couldn't be the last one out of history class, and he couldn't leave without Rory. "Rory," Oliver said a little louder. Still, the silently snoozing young man made no response. He poked the boy, and Rory shifted, taking in a deep, slow breath. On her way past, a female student with a permanent scowl, Oliver was pretty sure her name was Aubrey, accidentally hit him in the head with her backpack. Rory yelped and fell out of his chair. "I'm awake! I'm awake!" He fell into Selina's path. The universally attractive girl with long black hair looked at him sadly, offering one hand to help him up. "Thanks," he said, jumping up. He came to a stop right in front of her, too close for her liking, and smiled as he pushed his hair back. "Didn't know you cared, Selina," he grinned. "So you'll go out with me?" Selina Diaz rolled her dark brown eyes, and her forever sad-looking eyebrows pressed together in a grimace. "For the 304th time," she said quickly, and she had been counting. "No. Now get out of my way, Rory Henderson. Oh, and hi, Ollie." She gave Oliver a small wave before turning to go. Rory stepped aside just barely and let her squeeze by, and he grinned at Oliver as she brushed against him on her way out. "She's totally into me," he whispered to his best friend. Oliver nodded. "Yup, she sure is." No one could fault Rory for his lack of confidence. He'd been trying to get Selina to go out with him since day one of freshman year, and it was almost fourth quarter of 10th grade. Oliver at least gave him points for persistence.
"Mr. Henderson and Mr. Byrne,"
called Mrs. King from behind her desk. She gestured for both of them to approach, and Oliver noted with a sigh that they were the last ones out.
"So nice of you to volunteer for my class jobs. The map is in the closet."
"But, Mrs. King," Rory began, and she knew he was speaking even before he did. She cut him off.
"And the disinfectant spray's right here,"
she said, pulling it out of her desk drawer and slamming it down on top without looking up from her gradebook.
"You have 10 minutes to make the floor and tables spotless, gentlemen."
Rory opened his mouth, but Mrs. King looked up and glared at him. It was worse than one of the looks his mother sometimes gave him. His mouth was shut immediately.
10 minutes,
she said with emphasis. Oliver's heart sank. There came a knock on the door, and in walked Mr. Bates, the math teacher, dressed in his gray pants, black shirt, and red vest. "Afternoon, Mrs. King," he said, his flawless British accent flowing over their ears like smooth butter.
"Hello, Mr. Bates,"
she said, her eyes returned to her gradebook where she was meticulously taking away participation points from many of her students throughout the day. "I've come for those too," said Mr. Bates, pointing at Oliver and Rory. Oliver's heart began to swell with hope. Surely Mr. Bates hadn't come just to rescue them from the clutches of the King of Queens. But whatever he wanted them for had to be better than spending just 1 minute as her child laborers. Mrs. King's beady eyes peered at him over the thick-rimmed reading glasses that sat on the tip of her nose. The tiny chains attached to the frames clinked as she turned her head.
"They're working,"
she growled. Literally, it was a growl. Oliver wasn't imagining it. "They've a previous engagement," said Mr. Bates, never losing 1 ounce of his suave. "I must apologize. They'll make it up to you next week, I promise." Mrs. King glared at Mr. Bates, but she didn't dare give him the same look she'd just given Rory. Oliver simply shrugged his book bag over his shoulder and walked toward Mr. Bates, knowing that the matter had been decided. Rory followed immediately, practically shoving his way past both Ollie and Mr. Bates to get out the door and out of Mrs. King's eyesight as soon as possible. He mouthed an obvious "thank you" to Mr. Bates on his way out. As Mrs. King was grumbling to herself and beginning to spread the desks on her own, Mr. Bates escorted both Rory and Oliver down the hall. Rory took the corner to the right at the end of the hall, but Mr. Bates called out, "The other way, Rory!" Oliver was a little confused. That hall ended in an emergency exit door that led right to the road. "What did you need us for, Mr. Bates?" asked Oliver. "Me? No, nothing at all, Ollie," he said with a smirk. "No, really," he said. "You didn't just save us from the King of Queens because you like us." "Yeah," said Rory, "because you don't like anyone." "Not true," said Mr. Bates. "I like myself very much." "But not us." "Not that much, anyway," Oliver said. "That is true," Mr. Bates replied. "So, I'd like a single carton of eggs from your family's farm, Oliver. And, Rory, how does a free checkup for my old station wagon sound?" "Sounds a lot better than 10 minutes in the King of Queens classroom after school." "Splendid! I want both of you to go straight home today. Especially you, Oliver." Both Rory and Oliver opened their mouths to protest. They usually spent their Friday afternoons with Rory's little sister Annabelle at Good Eatin' Cafe where Selina worked. Sometimes Selina would sit with them on her break. Sometimes she would even do it on purpose. It was a Friday tradition that little Annabelle always looked forward to, and she would be heartbroken if they didn't go today. But the boys didn't say anything. Mr. Bates seemed insistent, so they simply kept their mouths shut and headed out the emergency exit. Oliver was shocked, more so than he probably should have been, that the alarm didn't go off when Mr. Bates opened the emergency door. But he and Rory just left the building the back way and took the back country road among the tall grass field all the way to the main road. They made the trek through the grass path in about 10 minutes, talking about their typical topics. Rory's chances with Selina that both of them knew didn't truly exist, how Annabelle was doing, Rory's frustrations with working in his father's mechanic shop that stemmed from their poor relationship, and Oliver's understood plan to someday leave this backwater town and finally go somewhere that mattered. Oliver, if he was honest with himself, wasn't exactly unhappy living in Heford, Nebraska. He liked the small-town vibe, the tight-knit community atmosphere, and the way everyone else in the world seemed to leave them alone. Occasionally they would see some uptight-looking man in a business suit with a strangely colored tie visit the high school to make sure everything was good as far as the state was concerned, and the teachers complain about the principal complaining about something the uptight business suit man had told them they had to do differently, and then most of the teachers would do the thing differently for about a week before it all went back to normal and nobody seemed to care. Other than that, no one from outside ever came to Heford or interfered with their business, and Oliver liked it that way. But that had made it hard to stand out or accomplish great things. And for the last 10 years or so, Oliver had gotten the distinct impression that he was meant for great things. It wasn't that he wanted to leave Heford. He just didn't think that Heford was a place where he could do something great, so he knew one day that he would have to leave. Everyone around him by now had heard him voice this idea at least once, so it was widely understood that one day Oliver Byrne would leave Heford to seek his fortunes. Most of them assumed that would be after graduating high school, and others also believed that Rory would be going with him. Most of the time on the grass path today was spent listening to Rory's latest idea for how to build their multi-million-dollar empire. Yesterday it had been an idea for self-cooking hot dogs. Today it was a mechanical device for the faster harvesting of corn, which Oliver had to remind Rory already existed. Rory never let Oliver's discouraging of his ideas get him down, and once or twice they had actually attempted to implement his crazy schemes. About a year and a half ago, Rory had tried to come up with a way to get a cable to find its own way around behind a wall so that it could more easily go from one hole to another without having to dig around, and he had almost accidentally burnt down his dad's mechanic shop in the process. He hadn't tried to enlist Ollie in any new ideas since then, but he hadn't stopped thinking, drawing, experimenting, or, most of all, talking about it. "I'm serious, Ollie. I'm limited only by the technology of my time and place." "Mostly your place," Oliver pointed out. "Yeah, but what's really stopping me from getting a coil into a hot dog and heating it just right?" "Money and time," Oliver said. "And also, you can't drive yet." "I can drive," Rory corrected. "But you're not allowed to." "No, not yet. And your parents won't pay for lessons." "No." "And if you try to drive without a license, you go to jail." "Right." "So you can't drive yet." "Ollie, you see problems, I see challenges to overcome with guile and intelligence." "Or by waiting until you turn 17 and don't need lessons." "Or that. Hey, speaking of lessons, what the heck was going on with Mr. Bates?" Oliver had been pondering that this whole time. They were on the main road now, a narrow strip of civilization cutting down a wide-open stretch of vast grassy wilderness and farmland. In the far distance, just before the horizon, a tractor was harvesting barley. Its rumble was just barely reaching them. "No idea, but I'm glad he saved our lives," said Oliver. "I swear if Mrs. King sprays you in the face with that cleaner one more time, your parents should sue." "They said they can only sue for damages," Rory shrugged. "Does brain damage count?" "I don't know. Ask your parents and see what they say." But yeah, man, Mr. Bates was really weird. He seemed a lot more cheerful? Yeah, like he was putting on a face or something. "I don't know, man. He made us go out the back. I can't figure it out. Something weird's going on." "What do you think it is?" Rory looked up at the sky thoughtfully for a second and then said, "I think Mr. Bates is an alien." "All right, shoot." "He's got a funny accent, always acts like nothing bothers him, and he doesn't have a past." Oliver smirked. "Well, he says that because he's from Great Britain. British people are unflappable or whatever he calls it, and you only think he doesn't have a past because he always says he'll tell you about his past if you do your homework, but you never do. Next." Rory looked away again, then said, "He's an assassin who's gonna finally strike at his target at Good Eatin' Cafe tonight, and that's why he doesn't want us to go there." "Who does he work for?" "Duh, MI6, obviously." "Oh, no, wait, he works for the KGB. "KGB? "Yeah, but he's a double agent for the British, and that's why he talks funny." Except if he was tricking the Russians as a double agent for the British, he would speak Russian or have a Russian accent, not a British one, and the KGB hasn't been a thing for like 30 years. "Except they are. That's how they get away with it." "So who's the target?" asked Oliver. "Probably the owner of Good Eatin' Cafe. Frank Mills, the guy who used to own the comic book store. He's a nobody. The perfect cover." "Why do the Russians want him dead?" "They don't," Rory gasped. "The British do." "So is Mr. Bates a double agent for the British or the Russians? Or what if he's working for both of them?" "Ollie, that's the kind of outside-the-box thinking that's going to blow this whole case wide open. That's how I know it's not actually MI6 or the KGB. It's actually the CIA. "I like where you're going with this." They talked about all the other possibilities, none of which seemed even remotely likely, but they were all fun and led to a lot of laughter, so it was worth it. Eventually, they came to the fork in the main road and split up, both agreeing to head to Good Eatin' Cafe with Annabelle as soon as they could that evening. They both agreed neither of them could stand the idea of telling her it was canceled, so they would just have to ignore Mr. Bates and go anyway. Hopefully he wouldn't be there when they arrived, or they knew they would have some explaining to do.